to make sure we all right. This meeting is being recorded. Has anybody got any issues with that? The link will be on the MII website. Okay. Thanks, Alison. So what we're going to go on or talk about today is restorative justice and policing in Ireland, and it's titled Taking Restorative Policing to the Next Level. So we're delighted to be joined by Dr. Ian Marder, and Ian is lecturer since assistant professor in criminology at Maynooth University, School of Law and Criminology. Ian works and he focuses on criminal justice reform, particularly through restorative justice and restorative practices. He mostly writes on restorative justice, using restorative practices in criminal justice and higher education and other elements of criminal justice. Now, Ian has also supplied us with documentation just to colour the webinar, and they can be found on the MII website. And he attached the documents, research on police facilitation in restorative justice in England, research mapping in the use of restorative justice and restorative practice in Ireland, restorative youth justice in Ireland, and a study involving dialogue between Gardaí and Black adults in Blanchardstown. And just one thing that really interests me, because I've a huge interest in policing and restorative practice. And one of the things that Ian says is that he likes to explore how best to reduce and repair the harm caused by conflict and criminal justice, and to corroborate and implement new ways to meet the citizens' and professional needs through restorative practices. And I really think that's very, very important. And from my experience, I spent 38 years involved in criminal justice. And from my experience, that's one of the most important things and through the whole thing. So Ian, can I ask you to take over? And anybody that has any questions as we're going through, please put your questions into chat and Ian will take them as he's going along.
Great. Thank you very much, Tony. I'm very grateful to the Mediators Institute of Ireland for reaching out and proposing a session on this topic. And hello, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming to this afternoon webinar on the topic of restorative policing, particularly in Ireland. But I'm conscious that I can see colleagues from other countries here. So this will be applicable, I think, to some of your settings, although I will, at least as we're having discussions about restorative policing, I will, at least in the first instance, probably ask colleagues in Ireland if they have any thoughts on its development in this jurisdiction. But I'm going to talk about a few different applications of restorative justice and restorative practice in policing. And I'm also going to talk about different ways of thinking about restorative policing, which are applicable, I think, around the world. So can I start by asking then, out of interest, who do we have in the room here and what is your interest in restorative policing? So what I might do, we have quite a few, maybe just too many for a quick circle at the beginning, but maybe in the chat function, could I possibly please invite everyone to just say who they are, where they are right now, and why they're interested in restorative policing? Just a brief comment if you have a professional background, if you're a police officer or an interest more in restorative justice, former police officers, people working community settings, just let us know broadly your professional interest in the topic, please, folks. Thanks, Catherine. So I appreciate we have a few people working in mediation. Some I can see working in mediation in kind of youth violence settings. Former police officers, you're very, very welcome. Joanne is a current serving guard. Hi, Joanne, how are you doing? Do we have any other serving Irish police officers, if I may ask out of curiosity? Please let us know. How are you, Joanne? Tell us a bit more about your role and your interest in the area.
Hi, how are you? I suppose coming from my background being in the police force for the last 18 years. I'm also a mediator and psychotherapist. So it's finding that link in how we can support victims of crime, members of the community, and our own colleagues then as well. So big interest in it. I have utilised it, have used it within the organisation, and have found it very, very, effective in the crime and the intervention, I suppose, that we were utilising at that time. So I found it very, very good.
Great. Thanks, Joanne. And I mean, without giving away any sensitivities, can you tell us a bit more about what you were using it for in the organization?
The case that I would have used it was in regards to a criminal damage case. And it was literally bringing the parties together. I suppose giving everybody the space to have their voice heard, giving everybody the space to outline the impact was the massive thing, obviously, for the victim. And it also opened a massive platform for both parties. I wouldn't just say just for the victim, but also for the suspect. It created a new level of awareness for him in regards to the long-term consequence of what had happened. I suppose that's just trying to keep it within the limitations, confidentiality.
Of course,
but,
no, of course.
I think, for both parties, massive awareness, massive insight, and it also empowered both parties to move forward.
Great. Thanks, Joanne. Really interesting. And I can see we have another serving Garda, Irish police officer with us, Angela, who does restorative justice panels. Angela, if you're able to do so, would you be willing to come on the mic and tell us a bit more about that? Is that in the Dublin service or in the Tipperary service?
No, in the Dublin service. So
Great.
I do it twice a month. Now I've never been a victim, it's just been the offender that's come in. And I find it excellent because mostly, like, they're usually young males, and it's the same kind of areas. It's like it's a socioeconomic problem, and a lot of it is just youth, friends, circumstances, just opportunity. They're not big grand criminals or anything like that, and I just haven't found the criminal justice system. I find if once they get the old conviction for being drunk and disorderly or for shoplifting, it hurts their life chances. I think it's better if they are able to divert, because it is really kind of, they're young, they're the usual 19 to 23 male from whatever. It's not, they've, I just think the criminal justice system itself isn't great for those low level crimes.
Great. Thanks a lot for that, Angela. Thanks for sharing that. And is there anyone else here who has an experience of restorative justice specifically in the policing context that would like to share that? Go on, Darren.
Thanks, Ian. I suppose I'm a former Garda sergeant, and I would have worked in the area of applied sort of restorative practices and restorative justice. We also sort of applied within direct provision, the very first sort of restorative Garda clinics. Would have actually worked and still continue to work with civil society and engagement with members of Garda Síochána in relation to dealing with hate and extremism. So it's about sort of bringing together community activists, faith leaders and local community Gardaí to actually work collaboratively together through restorative means and address the harm that hate and extremism actually caused within society. And that was done within the NEIC area following the Dublin riots. So again, I have a great passion and a drive for the likes of restorative justice and restorative practices, and obviously restorative policing.
Thanks, Darren. Any other comments or people would like to share a specific experience with restorative justice or restorative practice in policing? And then I'll move on and go through a couple of slides. Okay, no problem. Thanks very much, Darren, Angela, and Joanne for sharing there, and to everyone for sharing their interest in this in the chat function. I hope you can see these slides okay. Yes, Tony's nodding. Great. Okay. So yes, as Tony said, I'm a criminologist at Maynooth University in the School of Law and Criminology. And as you could probably hear, many of you can hear, I'm not from here. I'm Canadian originally, but I've lived in Ireland about 6 years now. And in that time, I've been working on a number of projects around restorative justice and restorative practices, including this one you can see here, the logo of Restorative Justice Strategies for Change. That project finished this year, but it was a 5-year project looking at the development of restorative justice in a number of European countries, in which Ireland was one partner. So we've talked a little bit about who you all are, and again, thank you for sharing that. I just include here a couple of screenshots of various pieces of relevant work I've been involved in, some of which Tony mentioned, so you can understand a little bit better where I'm coming from. My original or earliest research was on restorative justice in policing. Firstly, evaluating a program with victims of burglary who participate in restorative justice, and then looking more at the policing aspect of it and police officers as restorative justice facilitators. And that was my PhD, looking at that across a number of police forces in England. You can access that online. Also, then in Ireland, a number of projects, including restorative practices in police community dialogue settings, one of which we're hoping to scale up now, but involved using restorative circles to facilitate dialogue between police and young Black adults in a part of Dublin called Blanchardstown, where a specific local context insofar as, firstly, there's a relatively large Black community there compared to other parts of Ireland. And secondly, a police officer had shot and killed a young Black guy there relatively soon before we established that project. So we were doing some work in that area and hoping to continue and indeed scale that up in the coming months. More recently, I suppose, looking at the development also of restorative justice within the criminal justice system more broadly. That does include a mapping exercise where we are tracking and tracing all the restorative justice cases that take place each year, not just in policing, although within youth diversion is a part of that, but also in the adult system, including through the service that Angela mentioned she participates in. That one operates in Dublin in between conviction and sentencing for adult perpetrators, most of whom, as Angela said, are young adults. And then also other parts of the country that have a couple of pre-sentence services here, and also the probation service are involved in delivering some cases post-sentence. But the minute we have a piece of legislation that I'm not sure if it's going to get anywhere before the election, but in any case, we have a piece of legislation drafted, which perhaps the next government or the Department of Justice might pick up on, which aims to really explicitly permit and encourage and indeed incentivize referrals to be made at each point in the process. Now, here in Ireland, it is technically permitted, is in legislation that is permitted to take place pre-conviction and pre-sentence with adults, but there is no pre-conviction restorative justice referral process in Ireland, and the pre-sentence process is not encouraged or incentivized, and that means that there are very, very few cases that take place each year. It is also permitted to happen post-sentence, but again, at the post-sentence stage, the capacity to deliver restorative justice is very low. The awareness of restorative justice is very low, and there is no requirement or incentive to make a referral. And so the cumulative consequence of that is that there are very, very few cases. If you are interested in particularly cases facilitated by police officers here in Ireland, which, as I say, the overwhelming majority of which, where the police officer is the facilitator, would take place where the person who caused the harm is under 18 as part of this youth diversion program, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But as part of the Strategies for Change project, we have the website www.restorativejustice.ie, and on there we have published a number of case studies where police officers here in Ireland have facilitated restorative justice, victim offender work, including in some quite serious cases. And actually, one of the one of the real strengths of the Irish system is its youth diversion process. And in particular, that there are very, very, very few children or very, very few serious offenses where the person is not at least considered for diversion. And the consequence of that is that quite a big proportion of high tariff offenses committed by children will result in an often quite intensive diversionary process, which, you know, that would be in close alignment with criminological literature around, you know, as someone said before, if you can avoid criminalizing people, if you can avoid putting people through adversarial systems, you are more likely to help them to not commit crime again. Whereas if you you are almost guaranteeing that the problems in their lives are going to get worse over time. So that is one thing Ireland does very well. And a colleague of mine, Louise Ford and Ursula Kilkelly at University College Cork, has written quite a lot about the youth diversion program as well. So before we talk about restorative policing, we have to talk a little bit about policing, I think. And when one of the courses that I teach is policing. So I teach effectively introduction to policing for criminology and law students. And I mean, they all think they're coming in getting forensics and, you know, crime scene, this and that. And I'm like, oh, no, sorry, guys. I'm teaching you what most policing is like most of the time. And this is the big challenge, is that policing is a profession that is what we would call mystified, by which I mean almost everything you see about policing makes it less clear rather than more clear what policing actually involves most of the time. And another a similar problem that we have when we're talking about perceptions of policing is that our expectations of what the police can and should be able to do are absolutely sky high in terms of the breadth of the activities we expect them to undertake, in terms of the speed at which we expect them to do those activities, and indeed simply the capacity to solve all the problems of society, right? This is what people expect the police to be able to do. If only we had more police doing more stuff, then some of these enormous social problems, you know, would go away, or we would be protected from them. And of course, we know from decades of research and experience of policing that that is simply not realistic, right? There is no way that we are going to police ourselves out of these huge social problems. And I just thought I'd pull a couple of things that, you know, are issues here recently. We have, you know, the rise of, as you know, some people would say the rise of the far right. You could also say, you know, the rise of people who successfully organize the otherwise disenfranchised certainly is becoming more organized here, and that's a problem. There's, you know, seems to be an increase in the organization of people around, you know, the so-called problem of immigration and diversity. You also have, you know, the prejudice around, you know, what institutions are doing. And here's a picture of protests outside Blanchardstown Garda Station, where a young person was killed by the police a couple of years ago. You have increasing politicization of crime. You know, Ireland is a place that, interestingly, crime has not been that politicized for, you know, quite a long time. It was, in fact, one of the case studies. There was a book written back in the 70s or 80s called Countries Not Obsessed with Crime, and Ireland was one of its 8 case studies. And indeed, you know, you go through short periods of, you know, where crime is in the news all the time and the politicians respond. But, you know, more recently, we're seeing with the new government and the new lead of that government, we're seeing probably there's going to be a bit more, you know, crime being a political issue, to which the response is increasing punitive measures. Somewhat separately from the politicization, you also have what we call the moral panic, right? Which is, you know, a situation where everyone freaks out about something, right? And then because everyone freaks out about something, it gives the impression that that thing is real. And then organizations like governments and police have a choice to make as to whether or not or how they respond to that, right? So at the minute, there is a bit of a moral panic around safety in Dublin city centre, okay? Now, there is no evidence I have seen, strong evidence that Dublin is becoming less safe, is particularly unsafe, and whether or not, but that is the perception that is held, often held. And importantly for today, whether or not those things are true, if we think we're going to police our way out of that problem, we are going to be disappointed irrespective of what the trends are, okay? So this is the challenge, is that now we have, lots and lots of really interesting police reforms and activities happening around the world. And the question is whether or not countries are going to have the kind of the confidence, is it confidence I'm looking for? I don't know exactly what it is, but the balls, if I may say, to bring in some of these really serious changes. And I mean, one excellent example of this is what we call public health response to violence. Okay, violence, we know, is not something that we can that the police or the criminal justice system are themselves going to solve. It is something that if you want to prevent violence, reduce the harm it causes, you have to have enormous police engagement with health services, enormous investment in early years of childhood, cultural change that takes place. If the state is going to intervene, it's in schools and so on. And so are we going to have smart approaches to justice that take all of this into account? And what is really interesting, I think, in the context of restorative and in the context of the perception that we have huge expectations of what the police are able to achieve, is that when you actually dig down into the research on what the public want the police to do, huge amounts of that recognizes that it is not about the outcomes that are achieved, but the process by which those outcomes are arrived at. That's what we call broadly procedural justice, and legitimacy is a big part of that. Now, this is a research center I'm affiliated with at the University of York and University of Leeds over in England. And they did this recent project. What did the public want from the police? And, it is not the first study to identify that what people are really concerned with is the process by which policing is done, rather than the outcomes it is able to achieve. And as I say, that's very, very important for restorative policing. And I just include this slide because I think it is just the perfect representation or misrepresentation of the kinds of things that I'm talking about. These guys are gone now. I mean, she was gone pretty quickly anyway, but these guys are gone now. But it is not useful, I wouldn't say. No one benefits from this. The police certainly don't benefit. The public don't benefit. And if you think that we're going to reduce social harm through these kinds of narratives and, I suppose, tactics, then you're simply going to be very disappointed, because it will not be an effective way of doing that. I use this slide. I don't really get into this concept of defund the police so much when I'm teaching in Europe, because, in the US, there's a big issue around the militarization of policing, right? And the fact that actually, a huge percentage of police resources is spent on like tanks and machine guns or whatever. So, I mean, the context is a little bit different there than it is in a country like Ireland, where, probably the majority of resources here go on a combination of, human resources and buildings and that kind of thing, right? But I think that this, I saw this cartoon relatively recently. I think it's is a good example in the context of the expectations, right? If you expect the police to do absolutely everything, then you're going to have one sense of where the resources should be invested. If you recognize that the police are relatively limited in what they can do, and that's not a criticism, right? That's, the reverse is a criticism. The idea that well, the police have failed if they don't do absolutely everything. That is the unreasonable criticism that is not helpful for police officers, is not helpful for the public discourse, and it is not a helpful way of helping the public think about community safety. And I mean, that's the language that is increasingly being used in Ireland, is the notion of community safety. There is soon to be the establishment of, I was going to say county-wide, but I guess some counties will have more than one community safety partnership. And it's not obvious necessarily who's going to be on those or what powers they will have to encourage or resource collaborations with the services and communities that sit outside the criminal justice sector. I suppose this is the big challenge in terms of narratives and the gap between what policing really means and can mean and how people understand it, is that if you want to prevent crime, the answers to that do not lie in the criminal justice sector. Overwhelmingly, the criminal justice sector has a role to play in that, of course, but that is not where crime prevention really comes from. And that's, I want to say counterintuitive, but certainly it's not something that, at least on the surface, is really understood. Like when when you get into it with people, it's like, oh yeah, no, it comes relatively quickly, but at least, at the headline level, it's not the conclusion that lots and lots of people would jump to immediately, shall we say. So I just want to ask, out of curiosity, we have this concept of restorative policing, okay? Now, restorative, if you get 6 restorative justice scholars in a room, they're going to give you 7 different definitions of that term. And, community policing can be defined in many, many different ways. So I just wonder if I could invite people in maybe using the chat function to put in literally 1 or 2 words, right? If you had to come up with a word that you associate maybe with restorative policing, right? What word would that be? Or if you would like to come on the microphone, you're very welcome. But just throw a word or 2 in the chat. What does this mean to you? What would you associate with that? What is the difference between traditional and restorative policing? Okay, we have repairing the harm, directing to appropriate resources, accountability, addressing the harm, preventative. And yes, Rod, go ahead on the mic.
Yeah, for everybody else's sake, 34 years of policing in Canada and tied with restorative justice the last 8 years. I've heard this term before, restorative policing, and the first question is, who are police expected to restore, or sorry, what are police expected to restore in addition to the policing? Because with the limited resources, community engagement, community grounded, it's harder and harder to expect police to be very connected and perpetually connected to smaller communities. So what is it are we expected to restore here?
Great, thanks, Rod. Any other thoughts? Anyone else want to come in on the microphone? We've got repair the harm, direct to appropriate resources, accountability, addressing harm, process-driven and collaborative, preventive, victim participation, a chance to heal, community understanding, listen, understand, helping victims heal, build relationships beyond the institution of police. So there's a lot of different things there, right? And some of those might seem quite different from each other. But what I think is interesting about the things that people have said is they are all, whoops, and I've just skipped through there. These are all aspects of a restorative policing, which manifests slightly differently in different contexts, right? It is not to say that we need a definition that is so broad that it's useless in order to say that, whether you are responding to a specific crime with a direct victim, or interacting with someone on a one-to-one basis, or doing kind of broader proactive preventative work, the exact what restorative policing looks like will differ in those different situations. So if you take, for example, Angela has said repair the harm. We've also got helping victims heal and victim participation. What your guys are talking about there, I think, is when a crime has happened where there is a person who is directly affected by it and a person who has been identified who accepts responsibility for it, you can do something akin to restorative justice, right? A process whereby those people are able to participate to work out what justice means for them. What is this, the structured process, as Michelle says there, to respond to that harm, address the harm, and prevent it from happening again. But you also have these broader question of, if we're talking about restorative policing, do we just mean the police delivering restorative justice processes, or is it something a bit broader? Is it something that police officers can do in their one-to-one interactions? For example, a couple of people have talked about listening. Right? If the police are listening to understand in one-to-one interactions, then maybe it does need to be that a crime has happened for them to do that, right? That is, police are interacting with individuals, not because a crime has directly happened to one of them most of the time. So how do you do restorative policing when you're interacting one-to-one? A couple of other people have said things around, the police's engagement with other people. Someone said directing to appropriate resources. Right? So what is the role of police as a connector in restorative policing, right? Is it the police's role to see a problem, firefight, resolve the exact thing there, and then wait for the next thing to react to? Or is it about this proactive, being connected, as Rod said, and this is not something that's easy to do, but being connected to lots of different resources in the community. And when a problem occurs, and a couple of people said something about problem solving, when a problem occurs, you as the police officer, it doesn't have to be a crime problem. It can be a problem that whether or not it's crime, you might be, or there might be a perception that you should be tasked with it, right? And I mean, I always use this quote from a policing scholar who said, policing is said to be about responding to crime, but it's actually about responding to, quote, anything that ought not to be happening and about which someone had better do something now. And I think there's something beautiful in that, in terms of, again, going back to these expectations that people have, where, and if you look at the research on how do police spend the majority of their time, not only is it not, chasing a guy with a knife, as people might think if they only watch movies, but it's not even necessarily dealing with crime. It's dealing with social problems, with communities, providing support, liaising with other agencies, doing mediation style things all the time. So how do you bring all that to the fore? How do you develop a culture of policing that does that stuff intentionally, systematically, and in a really principled way, and drawing on the restorative skill set, where you can draw on that skill set whether you are proactively trying to bring people together in some problem solving activity, or you're working with someone one-on-one, or you are responding maybe to a specific crime or conflict or harm that has happened. Well, before I move on, does anyone want to come in on that? Has any reflections on anything that people came in with in the chat there, or that we've talked about so far? Go on, Darren.
Yeah, just to say, Ian, I completely agree with you in relation to the cultural aspect. I think very often people sort of look towards activities and see restorative policing as activity based, but it stems from that cultural aspect of actually sort of embedding it as a culture within the organization, ensuring that there's not a disconnect between how the police officers look look after themselves as well as the public, and ensuring that it's embedded consistently across the organisation. But then also equally, that principle of restorative policing extends beyond the institution and allows for people to feel much more sort of empowered to be able to play a role in dealing with sort of community safety and social harms. But I do genuinely believe it's yes, you know, the problem solving is one aspect of it, but it touches on that aspect of prevention, the prevention of harm, that very often, you know, it's about sharing that responsibility and allowing people to feel involved, that they can actually input and that they can actually participate. And as such, allow for people to feel that they're being treated fairly, with respect and dignity, and the opportunity to sort of address those harms without necessarily constantly looking towards pointing the finger of blame. And I suppose it requires society to be a little bit more receptive to the idea that we're all victims and we're all offending, you know, in relation to how we address social harm.
Thanks, Darren. Any other thoughts? Okay. Thanks very much, folks, for that. So I'm going to introduce to you just a couple of important academic books in this area. The first one is Changing Lenses by Howard Zare, and the second is Restorative Policing by Clamp and Patterson. So where restorative policing is seen as a systemic reform, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about restorative policing as something which seeks to interact with almost all aspects of how the police would engage with society. That differs from what we call restorative policing as a programmatic reform, because in that situation, it would be the police facilitating restorative justice processes in response to specific crimes. Okay. And what I'm going to talk about is some of these broader applications. How do you do restorative when you're interacting with someone one-to-one and maybe a crime hasn't happened, but just something is going on where they want to talk to you? Or when you're trying to build, you know, capacity in the community, when you're facilitating dialogue, how do you use restorative for that? What Zare says is that restorative is a type of lens. It's a way of seeing the world, a way of seeing justice. Okay, so you'll notice probably that a lot of the language that we've been using, both myself and people in the chat here, is, I suppose, a bit abstract, or it's at the level of values, right? And that can be quite difficult then to think about, okay, well, how do I actually action, you know, policing in a different and practical way? But I suppose the challenge is that, you know, we know that police culture emerges partly from well, not even police culture, organizational culture, right? Your patterns of behavior that exist in your organization reflect values, norms, unwritten rules, okay? So when we're thinking about how we're going to do this practically, it does require what in some professions they would call workplace reflective practice, right? Which is, what are you trying to achieve? Okay, let's talk about this situation. Well, what were you trying to do there? What did you end up doing? What is the gap between what you're trying to do and what happened, right? How are you remembering and manifesting your values in the way that, you know, in what you brought to the interaction you had with the person? So Clamp and Patterson talk about restorative policing as a systemic reform, a new default approach where the default that the police would do is to build relationships and enable people to participate. Okay, they contrast that with the use of force paradigm, where it is assumed that the default is to engage in an authoritarian way, or a way where you are making decisions for people on their behalf. So how you actually action that is through the systematic use of restorative language, questions, and circles to change how citizens experience the police. So what restorative practices teach us is that there is more to restorative than facilitating conferences or the stuff that kind of looks like mediation. There is all of those ways that you interact with people on a one-to-one basis, how you engage in group settings where it's not necessarily that there's been a problem, and the importance that you place on, firstly, the relationships you have with people, and secondly, the relationships that other people have with each other, and then thirdly, how you devolve power and control, right? You as the police officer are similar to other public sector workers, the judge, the social worker, the teacher. These are all people that have legal authority. They are obliged in some cases to make decisions on people's behalf, and that in practice, they have huge amounts of discretion to decide how they're going to interact with most people most of the time as they allocate benefits and sanctions, you know, within the ethical framework of their profession and within their legal framework. So before, I've got a few things here, and I'm just trying to decide what order to do these because we might not get to all of them. And I just think that what I might start with is around the policing practice in one-to-one settings, okay? Because we've already kind of talked quite a bit about restorative justice for responding to specific crimes, and we can probably talk about that again soon. But I think what is really interesting and what no country has yet quite cracked is how you can use this for what you might call mainstream policing practice, which is that you as a police officer are talking to a person, right? That is what a huge amount of policing looks like. And so a restorative policing has to find some way, has to be able to say something about, okay, if you are just talking to someone, what does that look like when you do it in a restorative way? So there's a couple of things I think are important context for this. And what I mentioned before is this notion of procedural justice. Okay, so procedural justice is about the process by which you engage with a person when you are in a position of authority. And what procedural justice says is that if they experience you as respectful, as having a genuine concern for their interest, as taking their views into account, they will experience that interaction as fair, as procedurally just and procedurally fair. And the importance of that, among many things, that reasons why that is important, but where that is particularly important in criminal justice settings, is that people are much more likely to accept an outcome, including an outcome that is not in their favor, if they feel that the process by which that outcome was determined is fair. Okay, so when you are working in criminal justice, you know, as someone said before, like your ability to actually benefit someone is very, very low, right? Like the suspect or perpetrator is not going to win. The victim, you know, even if you did everything you could, they still had the bad experience of the thing happening in the first place. So nobody's going to win in this situation, right? The chances of you getting an outcome in your favor to the point where you actually could conceivably be said to have won is very, very slim. And so in that situation, how you experience the process, how people are treated is really important in terms of how much confidence they have in the system afterwards, whether they think that the system is, you know, looking out for them and legitimate. And we've seen this a lot here in Ireland in recent weeks in the context of victims of crime, right? So one of my colleagues, Deirdre Healy from UCD, a few years ago was commissioned by the Department of Justice to write a research report looking at all the evidence around victims' interactions with criminal justice around the world. And of course, one of the major benefits of that is that you can try and use that evidence to avoid what we call secondary victimization, which is where a victim of crime experiences harm, not because of the crime itself, but because of their experience of interacting with the criminal justice process or a professional or system in some way. And again, those of you in Ireland will, this has been in the news a lot recently because we've had a couple of cases where victims have been very, very disappointed with things like delays in the court, things like people not being charged and that not being explained to them, and things like stuff that judges have said, during the court process, including where the person is then convicted and sentenced. And still, the harm that their interaction with the process can have, it can be greater than the harm of the initial offense. And the flip side of that is that for those vast majority of victims who are not going to get an outcome that is in their favor, right? Or indeed, irrespective of whether the outcome is theoretically in their favor, they still don't win because the thing happened to them in the first place. Their experience is much more contingent on the process by which they were, the case was taken, right? The way in which they were treated during that, than on the actual outcomes. So the other thing that is interesting is that in a context where someone is subject to police powers, whether that is stop and search or arrest, there is almost nothing that has ever been evidenced that you can do in order to reduce the harm that causes to that person's confidence in the system, right? Whether or not they are charged or not, or they feel that they did something or not. If you stop and search someone, you are almost guaranteed to reduce their trust in the police, okay? Whether or not they've done anything wrong. The one intervention where there is some evidence of a increase in what they call contact-based legitimacy, that is, whether or not they still feel that the police are legitimate after the contact with them, is in procedural justice. So, and as I mentioned before, there's more and more research thinking about, public confidence in policing generally. This paper, as I mentioned, talked about people taking a very process-based approach to what questions about what the police are for, less exercised about the outcomes police might achieve than the processes through which policing is conducted. So what I'd like to ask then is, does anyone have a view on the skills, the particular types of skills that police training might prioritize? Or let me start in a different place. What skills do you think police officers might have that might aid them in being experienced as treating people fairly and justly? Is there anything that you think police can draw on already that could help them with this? Feel free to come in the chat or just come on the mic if you would like. Tony.
Yeah, I suppose respect, first of all, to make sure that you respect the person, to make sure that all your processes are fair and honorable, and that you treat them as, I suppose, coming back to respect is the most important thing of all.
And what does that look like, Tony? What would you say respect looks like in practice?
I think when you're dealing one-on-one with somebody, that your interactions, that you're empathetic, that you're as supportive as one can be in the process that's going on, and that they know that you're there to do your job and to do it fairly and honorably.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tony. And just looking at a couple in the chat here. Michelle says common sense. Michelle, would you be willing to come on the mic and tell us a little bit more? Well, what do you mean by that? What does that look like?
Sorry, just unmute there. Common sense. Well, I suppose I'm in juvenile justice, and it's kind of with the projects creating the relationship and just showing empathy and understanding and just general listening skills. I have to just say, to kind of jump ahead of what you were asking, what we think we might need. as like in training. We were recently introduced to the trauma-informed care, and I thought that would fit in very well with the JLO training that we get, and but generally with restorative justice practice as well. I think that would be a step in the right direction.
Great, thanks, Michelle. What would you say is the overlap with trauma informed in this context?
Sorry, I suppose to create a safe space, it's like almost play therapy, where you're trying to reduce the panic that the person, if a person is dealing with a police officer, their operation of their front brain mightn't be fully there because they're panicked. So it's trying to de-escalate their feelings and adjust them, that they're able to think rationally and engage with the process. And just to make it that simple, that the person, like if you're giving a young person a caution, but if you can see that they're obviously not understanding what you're saying, or taking in, or frightened by the surroundings, or like, it is to bring it to that level, that you're trying to engage the person, make them feel comfortable, make them feel safe, because you won't achieve the outcome you want to achieve if they miss out on what's happening. So I think there's a lot of crossover, to be honest.
Great, thanks, Michelle. And let me come to you, Joanne, because you mentioned a couple times judgment or non-judgment. Can you tell us a little bit about that, Joanne? What do you mean by that? What does that look like?
Yeah, it's approaching any situation with an open mind, so that you're not going in having your mind made up, that you're meeting the person where they are, because you never know the road anyone has came, you never know the reason behind it, you never know the journey. So although you may not agree, and it may be obviously wrong what's happened, you still have to gain an insight into an individual's world and meet them where they are, as long as enabling the process and the role that you're doing at that time. So it's to work with them, to listen to them, to hear them, to understand it from their perspective, and park your own judgments.
Great, thanks, Joanne. And I'll go one more, maybe to Helen. You talked about communication skills. Can you tell us a little bit more of that? I mean, that's obviously maybe your MII background, that's a big thing in mediation, but like, what does that look like then for police officers in practice, would you say?
Well, I suppose like literally listening to what people, and hearing what people are saying, and maybe some level of understanding of development as well, age-related development, psychological development of the people you're dealing with.
Great, thanks, Helen. I mean, we're oh no, go on, sorry.
No, that's it.
Oh, that's it. Great. Okay. I mean, we're fortunate. We've got a number of, professional mediators here. I wonder if anyone else from a mediation background wants to come in and talk about, what kind of skills, like what does it actually look like when you are speaking to someone and you're trying to be experienced as being fair? What does that look like for you?
Don't mind coming in there, Ian. I think the summarising, the paraphrasing, the reflecting, the ensuring that you're hearing what they're saying. So you're giving it back to them in the context of what you're hearing, you're seeking clarity on it. And sometimes when words are spoken, it can create a new level of awareness. When they're verbalized and vocal, it can give a different perspective within a mediation process. So I think being able to utilize them skills as well can be paramount within the mediation aspect.
Great. Thanks, Joanne. Any other thoughts on that? Okay, great. Thanks, everyone, for your contributions there. So I do think that there is some element that, or to some extent, restorative practice can assist people in this area. because when restorative practice is given as training, it involves a couple of things, right? Let's say you're not going to get trained up to doing mediation style approaches, but you're getting trained in sort of restorative practice skills. Usually that involves, first of all, some of this kind of workplace reflective practice on values, right? What are the values of restorative, the relational piece, the participation, repairing harm, and how does that apply in your context? But also, much like probably some mediation training, a lot of it is also around how do you ask questions? What kind of questions do you ask, right? How do you give people a space to talk about their emotions around things? So you get people a space to say how they're really feeling, what's important to them. And, you know, as you said, Joanne, to be, you know, to demonstrate that you are listening to them. I mean, that's something that I think could apply it all across the public sector, you know, all across services. And certainly, you know, Tony mentioned before, we do some work in other contexts. We have recent projects in higher education settings where we've been training up. Now, I don't deliver the training myself, but, you know, other training providers deliver the training. And then I usually am involved in kind of implementation and evaluation, that kind of thing, and training up colleagues of mine in the academic sphere, and, you know, university administrators and so on, in restorative practices for use with students and with each other and so on. And, you know, entirely separately, a project which hopefully we'll publish the findings of soon, where we participate in a project where the senior leadership team of the Irish Prison Service have received training in restorative practices, including the governors, the operational people in charge of the prisons, but also the people in the headquarters in various sort of policy and administrative roles. And we found that they were doing some really interesting stuff. So the training was observed, and then there was implementation workshops, and then they were interviewed 3 to 5 months later to see if they were able to use it in their work. And there was a lot of really interesting reflections people had around, you know, the need to catch if someone comes in hot, catching yourself before you respond in kind, and being able to say, well, okay, let's talk later, or, you know, remember that maybe something is going on for them, and that's the non-judgment, right? And the skill of, you know, remaining calm and so on. And so, you know, that's just one example, but I mean, like, of a lot of what the practices that they were describing to us were not akin to mediation, but were more around the relationships and their interaction that they had with other people in one-to-one settings. I think there's huge potential for that in policing. So what time are we on here? So let me just go back to all the plans and think for a second. We definitely have time for one more. So you know what? I'm going to focus then on police community dialogue, if that's okay with folks. And going to talk a bit about some of the work that we've done in various settings in Ireland with numerous collaborators in the police, in NGO sector, and in the community, looking at how can you use restorative practices for police community dialogue. So this is from a project I mentioned before, where we facilitated circle processes between police and young Black people in a part of Blanchardstown, in a part of Dublin, called Blanchardstown, where the police had relatively recently killed someone. So what you're looking at here is a community center with a circle of chairs. And the first thing that we did after explaining, you know, what was happening and co-creating the guidelines for the session was to get people to give people an opportunity to get to know each other. And we paired people up, and they got to know each other. And it turns out, and then they introduce each other to the group. So everyone is talking about football. Now, some of you in other countries may or may not be familiar, but with the fact that everyone in Ireland, you know, they got a real problem with England here, except when it comes to football, in which case, oh yeah, you know, Manchester, Liverpool, these are really culturally important things here, despite or because of being in England. But so everyone is a Manchester United fan in this room, apart from this one police officer who is Liverpool. and it's going around and everyone's talking about football, and it gets to him, and he says, hey, I thought this was supposed to be about diversity. And everyone is laughing so incredibly hard. People think that they're people can really feel the tension escaping, right? It's a tense situation at first, right? Not that anyone particularly knew each other, right? It's not like everyone was involved in the same problem and then you're bringing them all together. You're just bringing together groups of police officers and young Black people from an area, but it is an area in which there had been lots and lots of tension, not exclusively because of this particular shooting, but also for a very long time, where young people had reported experiences of, excessive use of stop and search, discriminatory police actions, and so on. So what we found in this setting was that was a number of things. First of all, that people were extremely respectful of the circle process and the talking piece. And people were listening to each other, describing things that I'm sure were very, very difficult for them to hear, including, this is an experience that I had with a police officer where I felt very unfairly targeted and it could have ruined my life, and so on. And this is another thing that someone did. And, police officers talking about, hard times that they had in, whether in training or it's at some other point with, a police officer which was doing something that they didn't agree with, or indeed where they might have felt unsafe in the community because of something that members of the community were doing, and so on. So what we found in this project was that the restorative process enabled, number one, serious conversations about challenges that people were having. Number two, the expression of, I suppose, vulnerability and emotion, right, around those things, and simply around the humanity, right? The football thing, it's not a serious issue, and neither is, well, I have a sister, well, I like this singer or whatever. But still, one of the reflections from one of the police officers I remember well, in one of their interviews was, I talk to people every day, but we don't talk about things like that. And so we never have those humanizing conversations where we come to see each other as people. And the third point is, and I think one of the most important, is that it enabled the conversation to be undertaken respectfully. And what respect means in this context was people were listening. And by listening, I mean clearly paying attention, right? Not just that they didn't interrupt, but they were just visibly paying attention to each other and not interrupting, which I think is really important, right? The purpose of the circle process, you can see in the background here, the talking piece that we used that day, which I happen to have here. This is a little Canadian beaver, which I was wondering, what talking piece am I going to use? Usually I'd use something where I can show a bit of vulnerability or tell a bit of a story or something funny. And I had just been to Canada recently for the first time in like a long time. And I just had an interesting, that was interesting for me because I hadn't been in so very long. And I got this little Canadian thing, and I just said something to the effect of, because of course identity is very complicated and blah, 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 whatever. So this goes around. No one interrupted anyone, right? If you have ever been to a meeting between police officers and the community in any situation, right? Whatever maybe it's something really, really nice, or maybe it's something general, come and, give us your shit, right? People wheelbarrow in all their problems, or whatever it is, right? You will get a small number of people dominating that conversation, people not really listening or paying attention, interrupting each other. I mean, I may as well be describing a meeting in any of your workplaces as well, right? But nonetheless, no one interacted over 2 days. 2 days, it goes around. Everyone had an equal opportunity to speak in every conversation, and everyone listened to each other. Jane asked, who is a facilitator in this meeting that I'm talking about here? So what we did that I think worked very, very well, we had 3 facilitators. I was one of them, and the other 2 were one police officer and one young Black adult, both of whom were in this area, right? So the dialogue process was actually the second phase of the project, because in the first phase, we organized restorative practices training for a joint training for a group of police officers and young Black adults. And during that training process, that trained group helped to co-design what the dialogue was going to look like. And two people from that group, one from each side, so to speak, volunteered, I guess we'll say, to be the co-facilitators in this process. And that was something that we took from some of the literature on places where they'd done a lot of this, is that it's important for people to feel, represented in the organization. So we made a lot out of the fact that, all the questions had been put together by, a group of police officers and young Black adults who had spent time together in the restorative practice training in this area. And it was then being facilitated by people from the area as well. So this is not the only situation where this has happened in Ireland in recent years. There was also a very large project that unfortunately did get delayed a bit because of COVID, but a large project called Garda Traveller Dialogue, whereby police officers and members of the traveling community engaged in joint dialogue processes and circles and so on. And this was a session we had in Maynooth University in kind of late 2019, I think it was. And then there were significant plans to scale that up, which unfortunately I think did get delayed for a couple of years, but that's been brought back now. And what that has resulted in, as I understand it, now, I mean, one of the reasons I often draw attention to this one is because we evaluated this in quite a significant way, collecting both observational data and interview data. And some of these others, I'm going to talk about things that are a bit more anecdotal or experiential, I suppose. But my understanding, one of the major benefits to come out of this project is that there are now people from the two communities who have a direct line of communication to each other, right? And I think that's very, very important in that particular context, because what that means is that if there is some sort of problem in that community, then the person in the community with a direct line of communication, the police can say, whether or not they think it is a good idea for the police to intervene, or whether or not they think that they, as trained mediators, because this is organized also by the Traveller Mediation Service, which is an excellent NGO here in Ireland, the police can ring a person from that and say, do you think we should come? And they can say, no, in this situation, let us try and do something first, and so on. And so it's all about that capacity to de-escalate, right? That the relationships themselves enable prevention, enable de-escalation, because the police, though they might be expected to have all the answers, know that they do not, right? But if you are expected to have all the answers, and you don't have the relationships in place where you can turn to the people that might have answers in some situations, that can leave you feeling with very little choice but to intervene. And again, prevention, de-escalation are things that are very important in society, absolutely very important in policing, but the police are not always the best place to do that. It just requires, a very, very good understanding of the local kind of milieu and having good relationships with people, so that together the police and the other stakeholders are in a position to establish who should intervene under what circumstances, to what end. And, that's case by case basis sometimes, because you can't predict all the possible combinations of circumstances that will result in conflicts and so on. But if you have good relationships among stakeholders, what you can do is basically assess together collaboratively on a case-by-case basis what is going to be the activity or combination of activities that is most likely to reduce social harm in this context. So what I might do then, there's a couple others here. One is one that we've heard about from Darren already, where there was some work undertaken in a direct provision center, restorative Garda clinics, which meant that the police would go in, speak to people in the direct provision center, building relationships, doing kind of lots of problem solving, making sure people know that they can go to the police if there is a problem. A lot of people would come from countries where the reason that they've had to flee is because of police or equivalent organizations. So how can we expect people to feel like they're definitely in a position where they can trust police, right? Unless police proactively say, you know, seriously, like, if you need something, let us know, and well, let's see if we can help, right? It's not the promise that, again, the police are going to solve all the problems, but they might have a sense of, you know, what the biggest likelihood of a problem-solving process might plausibly look like for someone in a certain set of circumstances. There was another really interesting one, just to cut myself off for a few minutes, because there's a video here. So what I might just do, unless anyone objects, is pop open a video of a small project that took place quite near where I lived until very recently in North Inner City Dublin, where there was a series of dialogue processes between police officers, young people, and youth workers. And this would be an area of the city with a lot of deprivation, you know, shall we say, and a lot of social problems, and, you know, not very good relationships with the police. And it's really not always obvious what you're going to do in that situation. So just give me a second, because I need to share the sound. Yes, okay. So could I just, I'm just going to click play for a second, and Tony, will you just nod your head if you can hear this, please? Okay, perfect. Great. Let me pop that to full screen.
My name is Maura White. I'm standing here in Sheriff Street, which is a place that I grew up in. I was born and raised here up until I got married, and then I moved on. I suppose at the time it was my community. It was, I knew people. To me, it seemed a nice place to live. But as I was growing up, and I began to see that actually things weren't that good. I felt safe in it, but nobody from the outside felt safe in it. I never see police presence. In fact, I was brought up to distrust the police. From the outside world, this community was a ghetto. It was just riddled with crime and antisocial behaviour, and people were no good, and that affects you.
When you grow up in an area like this, you're sort of so confined to your sort of inner bubble, I suppose, that you don't actually almost look outside of that. It's almost like a defence mechanism that if we stick together in this small area, we'll be safe, we'll be grand.
I suppose you don't really know any different until you turn like 14, 15, you start branching out, and I don't know, you have to kind of make a decision at that age if you're going to go down the same road as all your friends, because I suppose in the inner city I just think drugs is a bit just part of the culture now at this point. Like,
one of the things that really helped shape me was I started on a CAN course 30 years ago, and I began to understand why things are the way they are.
One of the biggest issues we're talking about now is the whole thing around policing and policing in this area, and the relationship between guards and young people, because it's still not okay.
Yeah, I'll start, and coincidentally Noel is here, so the dialogue started for me when Noel knocked at the door upstairs and came in, and he basically said there's a programme being developed in the NUIC and it's being led by CAN, Community Action Network, who's a fantastic organisation, and there's an opportunity then to build relationships up with them. So that process started, and I developed a relationship with a number of young people. But what it really done was, it allowed me to develop a relationship with the guards in the community that I didn't have previously. And that relationship has further developed, and it's also gave the young people a voice within the community to communicate with guards, to build relationships.
For many different reasons, there appears at times to be a disconnect between the guards and young people, which you could say is a relationship breakdown at times, and that's where we've worked with CAN for the last 4 years.
You have to know the limitations and what you're working with. And the expectation that guards would come into this community and stay here, we know that's not the case. We know they come and go. So what we have to try and do is the culture within, particularly the local Garda stations, is begin to change their way of thinking.
They create what they call a container, where it's a safe place for you to say what you've experienced, the affect for you working in the area, and then also for children, for them to say what it's like for them to live in the area and some of their experiences that they've had with the guards. And so far it's been really successful.
Before that, the research, I would have thought that 99% of the relationships is negative. You know, what we actually found was there was positive interactions there, you know, and that was really good for us to understand that we're not starting from a place of complete and utter negativity.
The relationships now are very positive because of, I think, the dialogue processes in particular, because you learned how to listen to people, how to understand people, people learned how to listen to you, and with the methods we use, the dialogue methods, I think really helped that.
You know, I was really impressed by the fact that CAD is trying to address issues of social mobility, social exclusion, and social access and inequity. Yeah, addressing those sorts of issues and tackling those problems, improving relationships amongst the community and between the community and the Gardaí, for instance, was something I thought was very beneficial. So it's admirable work, really admirable work, and I was keen to try and help.
And we believe that CAN in particular with a social glue to bring that together.
You know, they're certainly not doing it for the money, it's definitely for the love. And you can be assured that any money you give will go a long way. You'll definitely get value for money for the contribution that you make.
Change isn't going to happen overnight. And I think in the last 7 years since we started working with the community activists and working with leaders within the organisations and in the communities, we've built up a trust and a way of working. And they're saying, we want to be different. And what I want to see is other people coming into CAN to continue that change. So there's a legacy left there. And because we know it works for me, it's working for others that we're with, and we're beginning to open up other people's eyes who are coming in from the outside in. It's opening up their eyes to say, you can be different, but you need the people within the community at the centre of it.
Okay. So I'm conscious that we just have about 10 minutes left, and maybe I'd like to try and get everyone out at 5 to, just conscious it's the end of the day, if that's okay. So could we just maybe see how many people there are? If we do a quick circle, maybe, I'm just going to go around everyone and just offer you an opportunity to give one reflection on either that work or what you think is important in this topic of restorative policing, and maybe really just try and take 15 or so seconds each, if that's okay. Try not to try and keep your comments relatively brief so that we can get around everyone and still get out by the end, if that's okay. So I'm just going to go around people on my screen, and at the top right I have Anna Doyle.
Yeah, I think it's brilliant. Thank you. I'd love to see something like, I remember the time when there was no criminal legal aid, no civil legal aid. I'd love to see a new strand of the social justice, criminal justice system that would provide for mediators and restorative practices. And because none of this would have been possible 30, 40 years ago. And perhaps looking to what they've done in France with the La Médiation Humaniste that was developed by Jacqueline Marguerite. And that has had very good success, I think, in the penal system in France. So brilliant stuff. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. Helen?
I suppose just thinking, it's very interesting. Sorry, your whole presentation was very interesting. I suppose just thinking of the kind of shift to kind of a culture of dialogue and understanding, and trying to broaden that out as much as possible.
Thanks, Helen. And Uriria?
Sorry, yeah, thank you. It was really good. And I will agree with the comment of Helen this in terms of culture of dialogue, because as part of the minority group, I think that's really, really important, because sometimes even conflict can start from a cultural misunderstanding, and I think that's something that has to be addressed in more detail among society and minority groups. Yeah.
Thanks, Uriria. Julia.
Hi there. Hello. Yeah, I think it's really fascinating, and I'm recommending restorative policing, but from a community therapeutic jurisprudence approach in my PhD. So it's really interesting to hear how, you've been going about it in Ireland. But yeah, fascinating. I think, the more communication and stuff, the better in the understanding, of what's behind, and suspected criminal offences and stuff, the better, really.
Amir. Or Deirdre.
Sorry, just trying to unmute there. No, it was really very interesting. I mean, that whole kind of thing, I suppose, about bringing people together and building respect and trust, I think, and allow that, when you were describing about that kind of circle concept of just allowing people to listen to each other uninterrupted, that kind of transcends into obviously the mediation setting as well. But it's just so important. Once people's voices are heard, I think it should just allow people to develop trust, I think. Very interesting discussion. Thank you.
Angela?
Yeah, I think it just have to be part of policy in the guards to work, because if I go and take a report of theft from a car, which is a regular thing, like someone taking coins from a car, that's whatever during the night unopened, I have no scope to do kind of restorative justice or practice. Like, I put on the system, my supervisor will say fully investigate, and I'm hopping down once he's identified on CCTV. I've given him a charge. So I don't have that discretion. I'm forced into a process.
Thanks, Angela. Michelle?
Yeah, I suppose in our JLO world, we've been operating restorative justice over 20 years now, and and just that you emphasise the distinction between the actual restorative caution, the structured process, and now your talk seemed to me more about the restorative practices and employing them. But like that, what Angela just said, it hasn't really gone further than us. I don't see it like it was promised 20 years ago that we would be the leaders and they say in our organisation, and people will be turning to us as to how this would work and what would happen. But it doesn't happen to the extent that you would imagine after 20 years. Like that, it's and resources would be a big part of it too. Like, it takes time to engage with somebody, and it takes time to get to know and create rapport and create the relationship. Whereas in mainstream policing, you don't have that, there. So, like, it is it's nice to revisit this again and to kind of to see the difference between the structured process and the general restorative practices in at play as well.
Thanks, Michelle. Maximiliano?
Thank you very much for the presentation. Well, I'm from Chile. We don't have that much of restorative justice yet there or practices, but I think one of the most important things that I'll try to bring to my country is the fact or the role of the institutions of police academies and teaching these skills that you were talking about earlier, and in the same level, like making a good agenda and a good academy project for the police forces takes a while, because it's an institutional culture that takes time to change. So we have to be very patient in Chile if we want to apply this.
Joanne?
Yeah, I think I'm going to have to come from an inside approach, but you know, creating awareness on the outside and through the community projects, yeah. But I think we also, from the policing perspective, we need to bring it in an educational piece to the members, because you're not just working from the senior leadership team down, it's starting with the members at the bottom up, because it's getting the skills out there, it's getting the knowledge out there, and through the skills, through the knowledge, that will hopefully build on the experience and give the members confidence to know the skills, to know what's there, and to know the resources. Now, I'm also hearing what my other colleagues are saying in regards to, you know, time, manpower, hours, and yeah, that's a completely different kind of aspect of it. But I'm saying from kind of educational, it's to educate our members and to let them know, because that training isn't there.
Anne? Anne Walsh, you're just on mute there.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Thank you very much. I'm not connected with the justice or the policing service at all. I come from a very different background, but a lot of what was spoken about, I have experienced. I used to be a workplace facilitator, developing these approaches to changing and I suppose working on in a different way in relationships in workplace organizations. So I understand completely some of the comments by the last speakers, and I would encourage them to be very brave and be very courageous about what they do, and make sure that it is understood within their particular context as well. I think as a society in Ireland, we're at a crossroads. We have been shocked, if you like, in recent times at the pace of change in our society. So I think that the more that can be published about this way of working, the better in the current context. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Anne. Don John?
Okay, I want to thank Anne and MII for organizing this webinar. And I want to say that globally, police legitimacy is enhanced when the police humanize their practice. So, and that's exactly what the video you showed as depicted. The people became more friendly and more relaxed, and with the kind of policing, and they actually say they describe the kind of policing practice that the community will be convenient to work with. So, generally, once the police humanize their practice, police get police legitimacy. Thank you.
Thanks, Don John. Rod?
Thanks, Ian. Another great presentation. Love hearing your chats. I'll be really interested to see if there's any discussion with academy leadership to see whether this sort of thing can be, rather than a separate class in restorative justice or restorative policing, but rather the philosophy and the approach woven through existing curricula, so that it doesn't take up, you know, it's not trying to squeeze out something else, it's trying to unify.
Darren?
Ian, as always a pleasure to be able to sort of listen and learn. Certainly from today, what I take from it is, I suppose, is the fact that we can learn from everyone that participates in that engagement, whether it's going to be a suspect, whether it's actually a victim of crime, or whether it's actually just a member of the public, that everyone brings some value into the interaction, and there's something to draw away from it. It kind of reminded me about this dichotomy that you see within RP, which is actually, you know, professionalization or democratization. And I suppose the other thing, I suppose, as a means of encouragement to former colleagues what has to be done, but how you do it is within your purview. And supporting and working from a cultural perspective, I can promise you, having done it firsthand, there was very little support from within the actual Garda structures, but you have discretion, and you'd be very surprised where you'll find allies. And when you reach out, people will come and actually support. So what I would say is build from the ground, build a culture, and the institution would have no choice but to follow. Because in this particular case, it's almost like an inflection of Ian's moral panic. You're creating a need, and they need to actually respond. So I really wish you the best of luck, and it's great to be able to participate. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Jane Bushell.
Thanks, Ian. I found it fascinating, and it's really interesting to see what can be achieved when people leave away there, particularly in, say, the North Inner City one, when people leave aside their siloed mentalities. But it's not going to be easy, because what you really are talking about is a cultural change, and maybe we need to introduce a bit more into the educational system so that people are not focused on their own little worlds and seeing and othering the rest of the population. But thank you, it was most enlightening.
And Jane Buzek.
Hi, first, thank you so much. This was an incredible educational, eye-opening presentation today. My background, I'm in the Chicago area, and I'm a conflict resolution specialist focusing on employee discrimination, sexual harassment, sort of helping organizations and people avoid getting into the courts. And I did gang crime when I first started, and pro se court. I guess the biggest takeaway for me that was really exciting, since I do a little bit of coaching, but a lot of mediation, was the restorative practice training idea that you're helping empower folks at all different levels to, pardon my cat, to learn these skills. And it just seems very empowering for everybody involved, not just the Garda, not just the leaders, but participants and community members as well. So thank you very much.
And I'll give the final word, thanks everyone, to Tony, our host.
I suppose for me, it's about building community, preventing crime, de-escalation of any sort of an incident, and building trust in community. And that's what it's about for me. And as I am the alleged host, even though you're the one that carried the show today, it falls for me in the end just to first of all thank you, Ian, for giving of your time and for bringing us on a very interesting journey through restorative practice, policing, exploring concepts, looking at confidence and processes, and particularly to all the kindred spirits from all over the world that have registered and logged on. Thank you all for giving of your time, giving of your experience. It actually has been one of the most enjoyable sessions that I have done with the MII, and that is down to your contribution, but more importantly, to you, Ian. And I'd just like to hand it back to you now.
Thanks, Tony. Thanks, everyone, for your contributions today. Really enjoyed hearing from you all, and hope that was interesting. And as Tony says, some of the papers I'm talking about, if you're interested in specifically the work with police in Ireland or in the UK, that's all on the MII website there. So any questions, feel free to drop me a line. Otherwise, hopefully see you all again. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you,
everyone.
One final reminder, the MII conference is on the 18th and 19th of October in Belfast, and we'd love to see you all there. And thank you so much, Alison, for hosting this thing this evening. Good evening. Thank you, everybody, for logging on, and particularly you, Ian.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Thanks, Ian.